In this video, I just want to quickly go over some supplies we're going to need for this class. So I sent out a list, I believe. So the first one I'm going to talk about is paper. And what I like to use is Arches, which is 100% cotton. And it looks like this. It's 140 pounds, which means it's a decent weight. Anything lighter will curl up too much when it gets wet. And it's the regular cold pressed, regular grain. Hot pressed is not suitable for most watercolors, usually used for illustrators. It's kind of a little too fine to work with for what we're doing. This is a block, which is a way you can buy it. It's a little more expensive than the other way. And the difference, what a block means is that it's sealed. This is coming apart a little bit, but it's sealed around the sides. So when you work on it, it should hold it fairly flat while you're working. So the other way it comes in is this pad. So the pad isn't sealed around the sides, and you can just tear off each sheet. And it's recommended that you tape it down to your surface before you work on it for a couple of reasons. But it's no big deal if it curls up a little. There are ways to flatten it. So this is a little bit less expensive than having it in a block. And I think it ends up being about $1 a sheet. The Arches also comes in, if you see this cover with the Arches, it's the same paper, but it's called rough. So it has a little more texture to it. So when you use it, you'll get a different kind of look. I think it's about the same price. I did this particular painting on the rough. And I use the rough for other things. So it's just another way, if you see it in the store, it's basically the right paper, it's just a different texture. And then this is less expensive paper called Canson. And I think they also make not only watercolor paper, but they make mixed media paper, which you could probably use for what we're doing. And this is also called cold press. And it's 140 pounds, so it's the right weight. Difference between Canson and other brands like Strathmore is the paper isn't as sturdy, won't take as much use if you do things like lifting. And then the paper is not quite as absorbent as the other paper, but it will work with what we're doing. So that paper covered. The other thing is brushes. So for this, most of this, what we're doing, we're going to start out using stencils. And there are two types of brushes. Flat, basically two. There's a flat brush, which is, if you see it, sort of right angles at the corner, and you look on the side, it's fairly flat. That's called a flat brush. And this one's kind of a short, some are longer, and those are usually used for shading. This type is fairly springy, and it's just an inexpensive flat brush. I use Simply Simmons. Sometimes they're called shaders. And this will work for what we're doing. This is a more narrow one, and then you can get bigger ones depending on what you're doing. This is called Aquarelle because it has this point on the back. So these are flat brushes, and then this is something similar called a sword brush, and you may see me use this for different things. And it's Simply Simmons sword brush. It comes, I think it's about $2 or $3. This is a 1/2 inch. Sometimes they're hard to find. Michael's were selling them. This isn't a requirement for the class, but if you think you'd like to use it, you can try looking for it in Michael's. So, And then the next is a round brush, and you can tell, you know, obviously it has a round ferrule, and this is called a ferrule here. And when it's wet, it should come to a nice point, and it will hold a fair amount of paint. Most of the paint's being held in here, so you can use it with a fine point, or you could press down and then get other shapes out of it. So this is another kind of brush we're going to be using. This particular one is, I'm not sure what size. Now size will change according to the manufacturer. So if you get a 10 in a Lowell Cornell, it might not be the same as a 10 in a Simply Simmons. But you can kind of get just sort of an estimate of what you need by just looking at it. This is a 6 round, and then this, I think this is about a 10. So either one of those would work, or you could, you know, you could get both. Here's a very small flat brush. I don't think we have to have this for anything, but it's handy to have. And these are also smaller brushes. So your medium-sized brushes will be fine for what we're doing in this class. The other supply I'm going to talk about is your paints. Now, paints come in different ways. I have that collection of paints I've been using. So I prefer the tube paints. They're just easier to get enough paint out onto your palette. And, you know, it's easier to know what you have. And I have all different kinds, but this is a Cotman, which is considered a student grade, Winsor Newton, and they're not especially expensive at the store, so these are good for beginners. And even, you know, I even use them, so I've been painting for a while. And now the Michaels has its own paint called Artist Loft, which you could also use. They're not the best huge quality, but you can use that for what we're doing. I've used it here and there. So these are paints in tubes. Now I don't have examples of paints in pans, other than sometimes you could get some inexpensive sets that, you know, are just a little set, and they already have little blocks with color already in them. You could also use that if you want. And the other thing is talk about is a palette. Now I've been using this palette for years, and the more watercolor you do, the bigger palette you end up with. And one thing I do want to mention is after you've put color in your palette and you're finished painting, you don't need to clean out all your color because it dries. Then all you have to do is wet it again to use the paint again. So that's an advantage of watercolor, that you can, you know, it really takes a lot to use up all the paint. So this is my palette, and I just have laid out some of the similar colors near each other. But all you really need for this class is a basic yellow, red, and blue, or a couple shades of those if you want. I prefer, for yellow, lemon yellow. It just mixes well with everything. And a good transparent red would be alizarin crimson if you're buying tubes. And then for your blue, maybe a cobalt or alizarin or ultramarine. But if you just find a basic pan set, you can go ahead and try that for what we're doing. And if you don't have a big palette, I've seen even experienced artists just using a small plastic dish, or you can use an old saucer or something like that to put out your paints. And to wet my palette, sometimes I'll have a little spray bottle. And the other thing you're going to need is paper towels. Have them handy. And optional, if you have a hair dryer, it will be useful for what we're doing. So get that out and have it handy to dry in between layers. I also mentioned to use masking tape to tape your paper. So I'm going to go into that process on the next video when I go into your shapes. So that's it for the basics. And when I go into shapes, I'll explain the different thicknesses of watercolor and how to see, how you use those different thicknesses and how to tell what you have.